Well, good evening, everyone. It's a new quarter, obviously, and we're going to be, as has been announced for the last couple of weeks, we are going to be starting in the book of Daniel for the next couple of months, for the next 10 weeks. And just so that we sort of establish this right from the get-go, for those of you that are a little more familiar with the book of Daniel, you know it has 12 chapters. I've got 10 weeks. So there are definitely some parts of Daniel that we are going to move much quicker through. So just so we can have those expectations at the beginning of the class, some of the more well-known parts of Daniel, we're probably going to give a little bit less time because I really, really want us to have ample time to get through chapters 7 through 12 because those are some probably less studied and more mystifying for some chapters in Daniel, and those are the ones that I really want to make sure we have time to. But also chapters 1 and 2 have a lot of importance to them. But before we get into the first chapter this evening, I want us to first get a little bit of historical background for Daniel because it's very important for us to understand where in the time frame of Israel's history and the world history that this is taking place. If hopefully everyone at this point was able to find in the back or in the foyer the two pieces of paper. One of them is an outline for the book as a whole. That's the one with the little map on there. Apologize for those of you that have trouble seeing. I tried to make it as big as I could while still keeping it on the same page. But this gives us basically the general chapter breakdown of Daniel and sort of the date and writing of the book. And then for this class, instead of doing a PowerPoint, what we're going to have, and you can either just throw this paper away, look at it once, and never look at it again, or you can follow along and write and take notes. But this is going to be sort of some questions to go along with our chapter. You can either review it, or it can just be some scratch paper to write on. I know some people like to take notes and like to work while we go through class. That's there for your convenience, and I will have one for each and every chapter as we go forward. Now, when we start talking about the book of Daniel, Daniel immediately takes place after what Old Testament book? Anyone have an idea? Correct, but also incorrect. Many parts of Ezekiel, and I heard a few different people say it, many parts of Ezekiel are happening concurrently with Daniel. And so this was a little bit of a trick question. I am kind of smiling because some of you fell for it. There are three sort of books of the Old Testament that are all kind of happening around the same time. Jeremiah, and then following Lamentations. But Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel all are prophesying around the same time. They're all contemporaries with one another. Now, Jeremiah was preaching where? Or prophesying rather, not preaching, but prophesying where? Jerusalem. He was with the remnant that was still in Judah in Jerusalem. And there's a few different waves of captivity, and Jeremiah really focuses on those that remain in the land of Israel, in the land of Judah after the Babylonians come and take the people of Judah away in waves. What about Ezekiel? Where is he prophesying? This is not a trick question. Anyone have an idea? Yes. Okay, in captivity, mostly in Babylon. So you have Jeremiah, who's with the remnant in Jerusalem. You have Ezekiel, who is in Babylon. And then you have Daniel, who is going to also be in Babylon, but he's not with the people or the large group that is in captivity like Ezekiel. Daniel is going to be with the aristocracy. He's going to be with the nobility in the capital, And really, he's going to be involved with the inner workings of the empire. So you have 3 different prophets in 3 very different places. And all of them take place after 2 Kings concludes. So when 2 Kings concludes, we see that there are a lot of kings that start with the letter J, that I'm not gonna expect all of you to remember Jehoiakim and Jehoiachin, okay? Just know that there were a couple of kings that did not last very long, that the Babylonians came, and what I do want us to remember is that the Babylonian captivity did not happen all at once. There were multiple waves, as we will see in Daniel chapter 1. Daniel is part of the first wave. The first wave of captives that are taken by Nebuchadnezzar back to Babylon are the best and the brightest, the cream of the crop, the valiant men, the smart men, the nobles, the rich merchants. These are the people that are taken first. And then the second wave are your not as filthy rich merchants and your craftsmen and your skilled laborers. And all that's left then are the common people. And that's who Jeremiah is with. And then in the final captivity is when Nebuchadnezzar destroys the Temple of Solomon, when he melts down all the gold off the temple and he sacks the city of Jerusalem. It doesn't all happen at once. If you read the last couple of chapters of 2 Kings, God gives the people multiple chances to keep Jerusalem, but kings keep rebelling. And we'll actually kind of look at those last couple of chapters when we get into chapter 3. But I just want us to kind of keep that in mind. And if you're keen for writing notes, and test those of you that I know some that are kind of history nerds like myself, anyone know off the top of their head when the Assyrian captivity happened? What year? It's actually pretty well codified in secular history. It's okay if you don't know it. Anyone got a guess? 722, there we go. 722 BC is the Assyrian captivity. And then the destruction of Jerusalem, there's a little bit of discrepancy. It's either 589 or 586 BC. So they're a few hundred years from each other, but we know for a fact that by the end of the 580s, Jerusalem is destroyed. So when we look at Daniel, we know that there are a few different captivities, and that Daniel was in the first one, and there was about a decade, 15 to 20 years, depending on what commentator and what expert you want to look at. The time frame differs a little bit, but most conclude that Daniel is written somewhere, or rather Daniel takes place, the story begins in chapter 1, somewhere around 600 BC, roughly. Some say 590, some say 605, roughly around 600 BC. We're going broad estimates with nice even numbers. And then roughly what many conclude that Daniel, near the end of his life, wrote down all of his prophecies and his life. And so many will guess that the book was written about 530 BC. Now, for some of you that may not matter, but this does help for us to kind of keep a timeline of the history of how we go from an independent Israel to the split kingdoms to each kingdom being taken away in the captivity, coming back under Cyrus, which Daniel reigns, or rather prophesies for about a year under Cyrus's reign before he dies. So we get Cyrus, that's when the remaining Israelites from Judah go back. And then we get to Malachi and sort of the 400 years of silence as it's roughly known. Okay, I know that was a lot of preamble, but I really like to make sure that we know context. This is a nation that was formerly in idolatry, that has seen multiple kings be usurped, be replaced by Nebuchadnezzar, be conquered, and they go in as captives. These are not independent people. These are people who are captive in the land of Babylon. And I know many of us probably know this, but it bears repeating this context. Okay, so let's get into chapter 1. Before we do, any questions on the history? Any comments? And if I don't see your hand, you can yell at me. Okay, so let's get into Daniel chapter 1. And I want us to start reading. If I could, let's see. Ken, would you mind reading for me verses 1 through 7 of Daniel chapter 1, please?
In the third year of the reign of Sullivan, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the king, or the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youth in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel,
Hananiah.
Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them and to Daniel. He assigned the name Belteshazzar, and Hananiah, Shadrach, and to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego.
Thank you. Well done on those names. I always forget when the names are there. I apologize for some of those more difficult names, but you handled them well, Ken. Okay, so obviously, starting a little bit backwards, we always remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We remember their Babylonian names because their Israelite names don't flow as well. Daniel, we remember because that's a lot easier to say than Belteshazzar. So Daniel, we remember his Hebrew name. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we remember their Babylonian names. They just flow better that way. Getting that out of the way. So when we look at what happens here, we get the first wave of captivity, as it is said. The king chooses the well-spoken young men after this captivity, because remember, this first wave of captivity is the best of the best. He took the nobles, he took the royal families, he took the commanders, the generals, and he took the intellectuals. He took the cream of the crop. And so when we think about Daniel, it's very likely that Daniel and his friends could have been nobility or related in some way to the upper echelons of the kingdom of Judah at this time. And I bring this up to say, when we think about Daniel, sometimes, we skip this part. This is a young boy. His exact age, we're not too sure on. Depending on what commentary you read and who you listen to, it could be as young as 12, and it could be as old as I've seen some say into his mid-20s. Though I personally am not really agreeing with the mid-20s. When I think of this, it would seem that Daniel starts as probably a teenager, or at least what we would call a teenager, though those sort of standards were a little bit different back in Israel at this time. Did you have...
Back to the names that you were talking about.
Yes, sir.
Their names meant something in Hebrew.
Yes, they did.
And then when Nebuchadnezzar changed
Yes.
So, I mean, that's a big thing in and of itself.
Well, and I was going to save that. You jumped ahead of me a little bit, but you're right. No problem, Clay. You're 100% right. This was something when we talk about, and we'll kind of if we look at verse 4, what was the point? Like Clay just said, the point of this teaching, taking these bright young men who had no defect, who were handsome, good-looking guys, that were intelligent, well, we were going to take them, that they were born Jewish, they were born as Israelites, or Judites, as part of the nation of Judah, and now we're going to Babylonianize them. We're going to erode their very sense of cultural heritage, and it's going to start, and this is where it often does, with names. Like Clay mentioned, all of those names had meaning. The names that we so easily forget because they don't flow as well as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those had a meaning. Same with Daniel. While what the Babylonians are doing is to say, you have new names. You're part of this nation. And we're going to teach you how to read. We're going to teach you how to talk. We're going to teach you how to think like a Babylonian. And we're going to start with your very identity to change who you are. We're going to take your name. We're going to make it something else. And that's a way of indoctrination. It's a way of changing how someone thinks. Is you take and you shift and you change their very identity. Larry, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, not everyone's name necessarily has symbolic meaning at that time.
Right.
But even so, what strikes me is it's a parallel to today. We live in a culture that doesn't respect God. They lived in a culture that didn't respect God. Here's Daniel, who is called his entire life by a false god's name. Nowhere in the scripture does it say that he refused to be called that.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, he had to go along with it because he lived.
Yes.
And so in that case, here are the things that they have to decide. I'm going to be called Daniel, but on the other hand, if they call me this name, this worldly, godly, false god's name, I'm going to live with it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be trained by them. I'm not going to say, I'm not going to learn your stuff, you ungodly people. Because if he had, he wouldn't have lived. And so here's how a godly person lives in an ungodly world.
Yeah, and it's about remembering that foundation. And that's something, as we go forward in the chapter, that I definitely want to come back to, because you make a fantastic point, Larry, and this was something we're definitely going to hit on, is the fact that Daniel doesn't refuse. He's not disrespectful. He's not unruly. He embraces, maybe not necessarily the teaching, but he embraces the fact that he has to learn. He has to shift and learn all these new things, him and his friends. But they, as we'll see later on in these stories, they do not lose their godly foundation. And that they keep that in spite of the indoctrination, in spite of, and I'm using indoctrination as sort of, that's probably the most uncharitable way of saying what's happening, in spite of the teaching of the new culture. And that's something that's very interesting, and I think says a lot about how Daniel was raised. And more importantly, how much he had the spiritual maturity to know that in spite of this new nation saying everything you told we're going to redo and we're going to change, and that's possibly wrong, he held on to it while still functioning and living in that society, but he didn't let that change the core of his relationship with God. I thought that was a fantastic point, Larry. So, continuing forward, when they're taken, when they're chosen, they are given these new names, and then they are put into essentially a supervised diet. Everything about their lives are to be supervised, because what's the point of all this training? The king is investing all this into these young men. Why? because he wants to make them advisors. The whole point of this is not just because he wants, some new fresh blood. It's that they are training for a purpose. They need to be taught because wants these young men of good standing, of good heritage, to be the next advisors for him in his nation. And to that extent, everything's going to be supervised and tailored. So, Vance, can I get you to read for me verses 8 through, we'll go ahead and do 8 through 13, please.
But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. The commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord, the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces and be more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see.
All right, thank you. So, in this section, Daniel does not like the idea of their dietary needs, and he goes and he talks to the commander. Why is it that the text says that Daniel doesn't want to do this? Is it because he's just trying to be unruly, he's trying to be obstinate, or what's the reason? Right, Nolan? Right. So both of those things, what Richard said that God would provide, and what Nolan said that he's holding on to his godly foundations. I think this is kind of what Clay was talking about a few moments ago, and what Larry was speaking of as well, is we see that Daniel is going to be given meat, possibly that is used in idols' temples, is given wine. The wine, of course, being something that there's very clear regulations on about being drunk, something he doesn't want to abuse. And so he requests that something different be done to the commander. Yes, ma'am.
Is it possible that this meat is pork?
That is also quite possible as well.
Second question. We know about these four, but there's other people there too, right, that have been taken?
Yes.
We just don't have their names, we don't know a lot about them, but there's a slew of them.
There's a whole slew of them. These are the only four these are the four that one received the blessings from God that we see later on in the chapter, and the only four that refuse to go along with the dietary needs. Now, some speculate whether or not some of the other young boys were Israelites. Some say no, some say yes. That doesn't matter. These are the only four that do this, regardless of if they're Israelites or not. So, when he goes to him, what's the commander's response? Yeah, he's terrified.
These kids don't do well if they're not staying at least as healthy as they were and, bring the crop here, right? And so if they start to slack off, if they don't look as good, then there's going to be a problem.
Right. Like Daniel was saying, if they slack off, if the commander is seeing that these boys are not well taken care of, that's going to be on his head. Like Vance said, they were scared. Or rather, the commander was scared. This is, and this may seem silly to us now, but this really was a life and death circumstance. How these young boys were treated, they would be killed for if done improperly. So it's sometimes easy to read past this and just go, okay, the commander's scared, okay. I mean, I kind of would be too if someone goes, I don't want to eat the good meat you have, I want to just eat fruits and vegetables. Me being someone who quite likes meat and bacon, would go, That's terrifying because you're just going to be scrawny little vegetarians. I say that tongue in cheek, not trying to be offensive, just tongue in cheek. And so it's very interesting to go back to Daniel because this is where we start to see a lot of his character begin to shine through. Whatever age he was, whatever age his friends were, I'm going to, again, my personal opinion, somewhere in the teenage years. You may think older, you may think younger, but whatever age he was, he had enough foundation in God to say, this is going to violate the Mosaic law. There's something here about this diet that's going to be bad for my relationship with God, so I'm going to stand up and say, and ask for something different. And I'll get to you in a second here, Vince. I want everyone, just for a few moments, imagine you're a young boy, somewhere probably in his teenage years. You are taken from your family, you are taken from your home, and as you can kind of see on that map, not a close distance, a long way away, to a foreign country. You're thrown in a room with a whole bunch of other young boys, and there's probably a competitive atmosphere. I kind of infer that just from being a young boy at one time myself. We get very competitive. And all these people are teaching you all these new things, and then they say, here's what you're going to eat. My tendency would be, I'm a slave now. These guys can beat me, kill me, whatever. All right, I'll just do it. But Daniel has the strength of faith to say, no, this is wrong. This is a violation of God's law. I'm not going to do that. And he doesn't do so in a disrespectful way. Notice how he talks to the commander. It isn't, sir, my religious rights say you cannot make me eat this food. No. It's very polite. And he offers it as a boon and an advantage to the commander. Go ahead, Vance.
One
100%. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. 100%, Vance, there is a very real possibility, depending on how young he was, that it was his parents or whoever was teaching him, because there's a good chance he was receiving extremely good schooling, because he was probably affluent, him and his friends, that whoever it was that instilled in him his religious foundation, his godly foundation, it was quite strong. And that came from somewhere. Daniel didn't just walk in, open up the Mosaic law, and go, I'm a believer. No, someone had to teach it to him. Someone had to lay that foundation. And like Vance said, there's a very good point here for parents, for grandparents, or even for teachers, that if we can lay that foundation at a young age, it has a better chance not only taking root, but buoying the faith of our young people when situations that may tempt them away from God come into being. And it was that foundation that he goes back to and that allows him to have the courage to say, can we do something else here? Go ahead, Micah.
Well, I think you're right that someone was preparing them only because of something Isaiah had prophesied to Hezekiah in 2 Kings 20. He said, some of your sons who shall issue from you, whom you will beget, will be taken away, and they will become officials in the palace of the king of Babylon. So if that were true, someone was preparing that generation when that came, that, hey, you guys are going to be going off to Babylon, when that was going to be.
That's very possible, yes. That prophecy to Hezekiah does show that it laid the groundwork that Daniel is sort of the fulfillment of that. Jessica.
I don't remember what class this was, but a long time ago, or
Yeah.
Josiah there. So when you have that mixed with his parents and then everything else, it's no wonder he would have reacted this strongly here, because he would have had all this stuff fresh in his young mind.
It's quite possible that he was around in the time of Josiah. I don't think we can say that definitively because, again, no, yeah, it is very much a hypothesis. It's interesting to think about that is a real possibility depending on Daniel's age, which, again, we don't have confirmed. We just know that he was a young man, and that's a very broad moniker back in those times. So to continue forward here, in the chapter, so he sets up this deal almost like a contest in a way to the overseer. And again, notice the respect. Notice that this is not done in a demand. He says, please, test your servants for 10 days and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food. And deal with your servants according to what you see. See, Daniel also shows his intelligence here. He doesn't just brute force the problem and say, you're scared, I'm not going to listen to my demands like you might expect a child of possibly that age to do. Instead, he says, okay, let's do a trial run here. And observe, we're going to do the kids that eat the king's food, and then we're going to do vegetables and water, and we're going to see who looks better for 10 days. Because in 10 days, that is a reversible diet. If they look so gaunt and they start, or not gaunt, but if they start losing weight and they look not as healthy as the other kids, that's reversible. It's a very reasonable ask. So Daniel shows his intelligence, he shows his respect. Again, to the point that Larry very aptly made, is that he's not trying to, while he still has his firm foundation in God, he's not trying to buck the system. He's not refusing to get along. He is working within the system while still not compromising his morals. Dana and then Mary.
I think he's showing his faith.
Yes,
He knows
100%.
He knows very well that they're going to be real good. It's going to work out.
Yeah, I do believe that Daniel has a confident expectation that something good is going to come out of this. God is going to take care of them because Daniel's doing the right thing. While those two things don't always equate, sometimes in our world when we do the right thing, we get punished by the world for it. But Daniel knows that there's a possibility that God's going to allow this to be okay because his primary concern is, I need to follow the law. Mary. No, I don't think they were vegetarians. I think it was to prove a point. It doesn't seem like this was their normal diet. This was he didn't have to drink the wine because the two things that were mentioned that were distasteful to Daniel was the meat, possibly because something to do with it being sacrificed to idols, or more than likely because there was pork involved. And secondly, the wine there, he didn't want to be flirting around with drinking wine. So I don't think this was part of their normal diet. It was just a stark contrast to say we're going to take water to drink, we're going to have vegetables to eat. And it's the exact opposite, and it's in stark contrast to the things that everyone else was eating. So it would help to prove a point. So I do not think that they were vegetarians. Okay, so the gauntlet is thrown, the challenge is set. Let's see how this turns out. Let's pick up reading in verse 14. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice of food and the wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. And we'll actually stop there. So we see after 10 days, the conclusion of the challenge, who is proven to be right through the aid of God, of course. Of course, we see Daniel is the one who is shown to be right in this, that they do in fact are fatter even than those on meat and wine, the king's choice stores. Now, I want to be very clear here, is this something that could happen naturally? In 10 days, could someone switch their diet onto a purely vegetarian diet and then gain more weight than those on their normal diet? Probably not. In 10 days, it's very improbable to say that that could have occurred naturally. So this is clear, and the reason I bring that up is because we want to show that this is not only from God, but on a more selfish note, don't be a vegetarian. No, kidding. That is, again, no joke. This is a point to say that we have to recognize that this was not a natural occurrence, that this is God's plan working out through Daniel, through these young boys. This is not a natural occurrence. Continuing forward in the reading to finish out the chapter. As for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Then at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. And for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. And Daniel continued until the first of the year of Cyrus the king. All right. So those of us that have read this story before know that Daniel clearly has God on his side and that God is working things so that Daniel can succeed. But here's what I want us to think about for the remainder of time. And some of you may disagree with me, some of you may agree, but I want us to think about this because this is a point I think can get very easily overlooked. Is what happens to Daniel and his 3 friends, is their success 100% because of the power of God making them successful, zapping them into being the best of the whole group? Is that purely at the hand of God? And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that God wasn't involved. I'm asking, is it 100% because of God that this happened? Right. Is that there was a work that had to happen, that they had to have some sort of work ethic, that they had to put in some sort of effort themselves. Anyone else want to chime in on that?
God gave them the skill and the wisdom.
Okay. So that's a very good point, Mark. They gave them the skill and the wisdom. But I would almost ask a follow-up question to that. Is, okay, they had the skill and the wisdom. Does that mean that they then would be fruitful in all their endeavors? Mitch, and then saw a couple more hands. Right. Mm-hmm.
They're not really sure how, but they'll press on. And that alone really kind of lends to success, along with the skill, the gifts that God gives them. That's how.
Yeah. Ian, did you have your hand up? Okay. Dave and then Autumn.
I was just thinking about the faith without works is dead. They had faith that God would protect them and would be there with them, but they had to do the work. And starting with the test, with the sugar, unfortunately, they'll be able to do faith. But that's what it is.
You know, that faith and works, you need both, and that you can have the faith, but you have to do the works to go with that faith, okay? Autumn? Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna say yes, because of God.
Okay.
They also had this education started before they left Israel.
Okay. The education started before they left Israel. Nolan and Jessica.
You know, when David was a young man before he became king, God chose David because of his heart.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite possible that seeing their hearts, and God saw the good, and he decided that he was going to rally around them and make them successful in whatever endeavor they were in.
Okay. Jessica.
It kind of goes back to what God told the people of Israel back when they were in the land. If you do these things that I ask you to do, you will be blessed. If you do not do these things, you will be cursed. Daniel and his friend, they did the right things, so God blessed them.
They
So it was 100% from God, but they had to do what he said, and that's what they did. In spite of being captured, they did the best they could.
All right. Janine, I don't want to miss you over there.
Sorry, it doesn't, all of this doesn't mean they couldn't have fallen.
100%. Doesn't mean they couldn't have fallen. Clay?
Well, 1 Corinthians, I think, hits it right when Paul's talking about he planted, Apollo watered, they were doing something, but God gave the increase. So the answer is yes.
There we go. So, all right, Ian, last comment, and now I want to get into sort of distilling this down.
Probably a moot point. It's highly speculative. And I know we're wading way into the waters of sovereignty. But you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, like it even talks about how God made the guard over them favorable to Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
Was that Daniel's doing? It doesn't sound like it was. And so there becomes this idea. It doesn't have to be a dichotomy of, you know, man accomplished this and God looked on him favorable
Yeah.
because this man had a good heart or he had a certain skill set. Likewise, to say that God moved him like an automaton to make him say and do everything according to his divine decree, it just gets weird because then we see time and time again, Samson's a perfect example. He's a horrible judge.
Yeah.
Yet he accomplished God's will.
Right. So, and I want to be clear. I'm not saying, I was never saying that there was a dichotomy. And what my whole point in kind of asking this is I think oftentimes, I'm not accusing anyone in here, but I think oftentimes, myself included, we can just read through this story and go, yeah, Daniel succeeded because God did everything. God blessed everything he did, and that's why he succeeded. And I think that is a disservice to us to take a lot of the comments that were said. Yes, Daniel needed his faith. Yes, Daniel, this was clearly because God was working it to happen. As it says in verse 17, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. The knowledge, the skills, like was said, was given to them. All the knowledge and skills was given to Daniel and his 4 friends. But I think the part that we sometimes forget, or maybe just overlook, is they then had to use them. And I think Clay really encapsulated that well by bringing in 1 Corinthians. Apollos watered, Paul planted. They're doing something. They're doing works. There is something that they're doing on their part. And we talked about this with the idea of grace. Is that grace is not always unmerited, like we saw with Noah. And it's hard to read this example of Daniel and his 3 friends in chapter 1 and not think of, at least for me, to think of Joseph and to think of Esther, who are both put in very similar situations to Daniel. And both, by the help of God, are able to rise very high and receive recognition from those in authority over them. But also, there is something of their character. I can't remember who said it, but someone, I think it was you, Nolan, that brought up the heart, that God chooses people like David because of their heart. There's something about Daniel's character, I think we can emulate, not just say, well, Daniel was blessed by God, that's why Daniel was successful. I think that does a disservice to us, because we're just saying, well, there's not really anything to learn from Daniel and to emulate other than to just be blessed by God and to have faith that God will make sure everything turns out okay, which that faith is extremely important. I am not belittling that at all. But what we see from Daniel's character is someone who puts in the work, who is honest, who is someone that is desirable to be put in these situations. And, just looking at verse 17, how many people actually study? Right? How many times, I know for me, sometimes I would go home, okay, I got a big math test, time to study, open up the math book and, okay. Daniel and his friends had to put in the effort to learn, to be good students, to be diligent workers. And that is something we can emulate. We don't just rely upon, and to the point that Jessica said, we don't just sit there and say, okay, God, I have faith in you, I believe in you, now let all the good things come. There is faith, of course, this is a wonderful practical example of faith and works. And I'm not, to be very clear, so that there's no misconstruing or misunderstanding, works alone do not save. That's not the argument that we're trying to make here tonight. The point is that with Daniel, is we can emulate his character. We can be the diligent worker, the hard worker, the one who studies, the one who puts in the effort, and pray that God helps it to increase in us. If we just sit back and say, God, help me get more knowledge in the Bible. God, help me to be a better person. Help me to have more patience. Help me to have more love and more joy. And we just sit around and do no studying, no further praying, no working on ourselves, trying to be more patient, trying to be more loving, trying to be more forgiving. Are we going to grow and increase?
There's an old saying, pray to God, but row for the shore.
There we go. Pray to God, row for the shore. I think there's a decent bit of truth to that. And that's the big takeaway I want us to have when we think of this first chapter, is Daniel is in this position, no doubt because God put him there. We're not saying that that's not the case, but Daniel's heart was that of a diligent worker, of a diligent student, and of a young man with the highest character and respect for those around him. One last thing to what Ian said of, the commander in chapter 2, we'll see that the commander had great respect for Daniel, and that he had been shown favor, or that he had found favor, or Daniel had found favor in the guard captain's eyes. Well, why is that? One, because of the assistance of God to make him so excellent and smart and to give him dreams and all of that. But number two is character. If Daniel was arrogant, prideful, disrespectful, you think he would have had the respect of that guard commander? Probably not. And that's all I want us to think about. You may still, after all this, disagree and say, no, it was God 100%, and that's fine. And I hope I did a well enough job to articulate why I think that there's an aspect here of both faith and works. We've got, well, actually, no, we don't. We are plumb out of time. Before we end, Larry Robbins, would you mind leading us in a closing word of prayer? If not, then I'll do it.